In the first part of this series, I explored how we live in the context of the social age. We are radically connected, and this connectivity and emergent rise of community and distribution of power acts upon our organizations. I set a backdrop for the arrival of generative AI to say that there's a shift in our organizations between the formal and the social. And indeed, we see this through a much broader interest in learning communities and in social and collaborative models of learning. But the ways we learn isn't agnostic of our context and environment. As context and environment changes, so too does how we learn. And of course, we've seen this through history. As printing presses and pens and paper became more prevalent, as typewriters and personal computing and mobile phones became prevalent, they shifted how we learn. And at a more subtle level, they shifted the nature of what we are learning and how we hold our capability, individually and increasingly organizationally. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be exploring learning with AI in the flow of work against this broader backdrop. I talked a little last time about our radical connectivity. We are connected in many different ways, almost all of which fall outside the oversight or control of any organization. We're connected through social technologies as well as formal ones. And in the landscape of trust research, we saw that people trusted social technologies more than the formal ones. We understand that there is oversight within formal systems, but in social ones, we believe we have more ownership of the story. And indeed, that itself is more relevant in an age of generative AI, when organizations are seeking and starting to mine the data that is given to them by people in their everyday conversation and social context. The questions of who owns that story will become increasingly relevant. Our radical connectivity means we don't just maintain close, strong social ties. We have an increasing number of weak and distributed ones. And this has led me in my work to consider our taxonomy of communities a little bit differently, to think about it as our active communities. But then when we fall out of those communities of experience or alumni groups, they become a loosely interconnected, very broad social context. And at point of need, we reassemble these things at first and second degrees of trust. Social collaborative technologies allow us to hold these loose networks of connections. And indeed, social media allow us to maintain this sense of connection. Just think if you've ever found yourself catching up with somebody you haven't seen for a few years, but saying, oh, I feel like we've been in touch because I've seen what you're up to on Facebook or LinkedIn. So we maintain these connections, but they're not really an active and dynamic community. Our radical connectivity means we have a greater potential for sense-making and a greater potential access to knowledge and ideas. Now, this does raise questions when we think about knowledge, about validation and trust. How do we know that what we are learning is true? Well, into that, I might inject a troublesome idea that maybe it could be true enough. Now, of course, we're used to existing in a world where there are some formal mechanisms, like a Western scientific methodology, to create truths. And some things indeed are true and validated in specific ways, through mathematical formula, through experimentation, through replication. But other things, other of our truths, are far less rigorous than that. Where's your favourite pizza place? That's very much a subjective, personal piece, but it may also be woven through the experiences of others and the stories that they've shared. True enough is a troubling concept, especially in organisations which rely on replicability and conformity. In compliance-led and regulated environments, we're going to be deeply uncomfortable if we talk about things being true enough. And yet that is how we often operate as humans. We have our fixed and rigorous knowledge, and we have increasing amounts of stuff that's floating around us. So clearly there is a capability we have to focus on in terms of understanding validation, in terms of understanding how we can be deceived or fooled, but we may also need to evolve our understanding of truth and truthfulness and trust and trustfulness, of what is good knowledge and bad knowledge, because sometimes we need a bit of both. But like putting too much salt on your food, if you have too much of the bad stuff, it's probably not very good for you. So crowd truth is an idea we should consider. as people start to adopt generative AI, and I say people rather than organizations, because clearly the most interesting experimentation is being done tribally and socially, we will confront some of these things. How are we going to hold our stance on truth? How are we going to ensure validity in a world where we no longer own the edges of the spaces? People are connected, people are engaged in different types of sense-making structures, and the boundaries between these things are becoming increasingly permeable.